B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Nun Tes. We're going to start 11 lines from the bottom of Daf Nun Ches, Omid Beis. Says the Gemara, Tonu Rabbanon, Minayin shelo yehei dovar koidem l'tomid shel shachar. What's the source that nothing is allowed to be put onto the Mizbeach before the korban tomid shel shachar? We've already discussed that there are two korban tomids that were brought every day. Korban oila, one was a korban tomid shel shachar, and one was korban tomid shel beinu arbaim. The first korban in the morning was korban tomid shel shachar, which that corresponds to what we daven today, the shacharis, and then the last korban that was brought, almost the last korban besides for korban Pesach, on Erev Pesach, the last korban every day that was offered on the Mizbeach was the korban tomid shel beinu arbaim that was brought in the afternoon every day. And we saw on Daf Nun Ches already earlier exactly what time the korban tomid was brought. So the Bryce is now saying, what's the source that you're not allowed to offer any korbanos onto the Mizbeach before the korban tomid shel shachar is put on the Mizbeach? Talmud Loimer. It says in the Pasuk goes, V'ha'esh ala Mizbeach tukad boi lo yisichbe, the fire on the Mizbeach will burn for always, will not get extinguished. Vir oleo hakoyin, Eitzim, and the Kohen will burn on it, will arrange on it and burn on it wood on the fireplace on the Mizbeach, baboiker, every morning. V'orach oleo ha'oila, he will arrange on these woods on the Mizbeach, the korban oila, the korban tomid shel shachar. V'hiktir oleo chel ve'ashlomim, and he will put the chalovim, the fats of the shlomim, onto it. And we'll have to see in the Gemara now, when it says V'orach oleo ha'oila, the Pasuk doesn't explicitly say it's talking about the korban tomid shel shachar, but the Gemara will say that ha'oila, the oila, is referring to that korban tomid, and v'hiktir oleo, one will burn on the korban tomid shel shachar, chel ve'ashlomim, the fats of the shlomim, and we'll see soon in the Gemara that that's going to teach us that all korbanos have to be brought on the korban tomid shel shachar, not before. So says the Gemara, since it says in the Pasuk, V'orach oleo ha'oila, that one arranges on the Mizbeach, on the woods of the Mizbeach, ha'oila, the oila, and it seems that whichever oila this is referring to is the very first korban that is allowed to be brought in the day, no other korban is before that. So asks the Gemara, my Talmuda, from where do you see that the word ha'oila, the oila, is referring to the korban tomid shel shachar? The Pasuk doesn't tell us that explicitly. Omar Rava explains, ha'oila, oila rishono, since it's got a hey hayadiyah, the oila, that one known oila. Which one is that? It's the very first one which is brought in the Psukim, and that is the korban oila. Rashi says that ha'oila is ha'chashuva ha'amura tchila l'kol ha'oilos, v'hainu oilas tomid the parashas korbanos. The very first korban that's mentioned is the korban oila. It's the oila, and the one that has to be arranged first on the Mizbeach before any other korbanos. Asks the Gemara, asks the Brayso, minayin she'ein dover koriv achar tomid shel beinu arbaim. How do you know that the very last korban every day has to be the korban tomid shel beinu arbaim, and one's not allowed to offer any korbanos onto the Mizbeach after the korban tomid shel beinu arbaim? Talmud Loima, it says in that very same pasuk, v'hiktir oleho chel ve'ashlomim, that the fats of the shlomim, which, okay, we'll see in a minute what the word shlomim means. The word shlomim, literally translated, would mean a korban shlomim, one of the korbanos which are offered in the Mizbeach. But the pasuk is saying, v'hiktir oleho, the shlomim, the chelve shlomim, are offered or burnt on it, on the korban tomid shel shachar, which means after the korban tomid shel shachar, the korban shlomim is brought, or whichever this shlomim is, and it has to be brought on the korban tomid shel shachar, not on the korban tomid shel beinu arbaim, the korban tomid shel beinu arbaim, marking the last korban of the day. Asks the Gemara, my Talmuda, what do you see from the words v'hiktir oleo chel ve'ashlomim? Says a machlekes, Omar Abaya, oleo shlomim, on the korban tomid shel shachar, which is v'orach oleo ha'oila, we saw a few lines back, that's the korban tomid shel shachar. On it, one would bring the shlomim, v'lo chaver shlomim, but the korban shlomim should not be offered on the other korban tomid, referring to the korban tomid shel beinu arbaim. Maskif lo Rava. Rava asks a question. According to you, Abaya, that you are understanding that the source that you're not allowed to bring karbonis after the korban tamid shel bein arbaim is from the fact that the Torah says that the chelve shlomim, the fats that are offered from a korban shlomim, have to be burnt on the korban tamid shel shachar, not on the korban tamid shel bein arbaim. Then we only know that shlomim hu deloi nakriv, that a korban shlomim you're not allowed to bring after the korban tamid shel bein arbaim. Ha oilos nakriv, but you don't know that korban oilo, different type of korban, maybe that can be brought after the korban tamid shel bein arbaim. Elo marova, Rava explains that when it says in the pasuk v'hikte oleho chel ve'ashlomim, what does that mean? Oleo hashleim. The word shlomim actually refers to hashleim. You should complete. That all the karbonis should be on it, on the korban tamid shel shachar. Hashleim, make sure that all the karbonis have been offered on it. Kol karbonis, kulon, all the karbonis, and not after the korban tamid shel bein harbaim. Continues the Gemara, and this is now another brisa regarding the order, the sequence of the avodos that were done at the end of the day. Tonu Rabbanon, Tomid koidem lePesach. The korban tamid was offered before the korban Pesach. We've already learnt about that. And this is referring to the korban tamid shel bein arbaim, even though all other korbanos were not allowed to be brought after the korban tamid shel bein arbaim, but the korban Pesach was allowed to. Pesach, koidem l'kteires. After the korban tamid, on Erev Pesach one would bring the korban Pesach, and on every other day, obviously there's no korban Pesach, one would then offer the kteires. In the kteires, these were spices that were offered up on the mizbeach inside the heichal, the small mizbeach. That would be the avodah of the kteires. And kteires kodemes leneiros, and the avodah of putting the kteires on the mizbeach was done before the avodah of hadlokas neiros, of lighting the menorah, which was also in the heichal. And now the Gemara is going to explain, or the Brisa explains, why was the korban tamid? What's the source that the korban tamid shel bein arbaim was before the korban Pesach? You should delay the thing referring to korban Pesach. Shenemar boy, that it says in the pasuk regarding korban Pesach, bo'erev ubein arbaim. The pasuk also says that the korban Pesach is brought bo'erev, and also says that the korban Pesach is brought bein arbaim, which is a double term referring to later in the evening, later in the afternoon, and that is delayed more than l'dova sheloi nemar boy bo'erev elo bein arbaim bilvad, and that comes after the korban tamid, which it only says bein arbaim, meaning that it was brought earlier on in the afternoon, and that's the source that the korban tamid shel bein arbaim is brought before the korban Pesach. Says the Gemara, if it's true that the korban Pesach is the very last korban because it says bo'erev and bein arbaim, k'teires v'neiros nami, by k'teires and the hadlokas haneiros, nami nekadmu lePesach, it should also be before Pesach, for the same reason that yu'uchor dover shenemar boy bo'erev ubein arbaim ledover shloi nemar boy elo bein arbaim bilvad. When it comes to the k'teires and the menorah, it only says bein arbaim, like the korban tamid. It doesn't say bo'erev and bein arbaim. And the same source that teaches us that korban Pesach is after the korban tamid shel bein arbaim, so too the korban Pesach should be after k'teires and after the hadlokas haneiros. Answers the Gemara, you're right, but in the parsha of the hadlokas neiros, there's another pasuk that seems to tell us that the neiros are even later, are the last thing that is done in the day. Shani Hasam, that regarding the neiros, the menorah is different. The miut rachmana oisoi. It says in the pasuk oisoi, and from oisoi we learn that the hadlokas neiros is even after the korban Pesach, and we'll soon see that the k'teires and the neiros are learnt from each other. The Tani we learnt in the Brisa. The pasuk says as follows: Ba'oyel moed michutz laparoiches, in the oil moed. In the Beis Hamikdash, this was called the Heichal. Asher al ha'edus yaruch Aaron uvonov me'erev ad boiker lifnei Hashem chuk haselim nedoyrosam me'is b'nei Yisrael. So when it says in the pasuk regarding the menorah, it says me'erev ad boiker. It says yaruch oisoi Aaron uvonov me'erev ad boiker. What does it mean me'erev ad boiker? So the Brisa says, the first thing the Brisa says, ten lom midosa, put enough oil into the candles, into the menorah, shetahei doilekes me'erev ad boiker. There should be enough oil in the lamps of the menorah that they should be able to stay alight right through the night, from when it was lit all the way to the morning. Dova achir. Another thing that we learn from this pasuk, Ein lecha avoida shekshera me'erev ad boiker. The only avoida, that means the last avoida, that means that the very last avoida which you're allowed to start in the Beis Hamikdash is the one that is me'erev. It's the conclusion of the day. It sparks the erev and is the only avoida that continues till boiker, till the morning. Elozu bilvad is only the menorah. That means the menorah sparks the end of the day, the last avodah that's done, me'erev ad boiker, and it continues till the morning, and no other avodah is allowed to be started after the menorah. Ein lecha avodah shekshera me'erev ad boiker elo zu bilvad. Mai tama. Omar, what's the source for this? Omar Kra, it says in the pasuk, Yaroich oisoi ari nuvonov me'erev ad boiker. When it says oisoi, it means it. That means me'erev ad boiker. From the evening till the morning, what's happening? That's oisoi. Only the menorah is being lit from the erev. After that, nothing gets done. Oisoi me'erev ad boiker, ve'ein dover acher me'erev ad boiker. No other avodah is allowed to be started after the candles are lit. Ve'iskash k'teres l'neiros, and the pasuk actually speaks about the k'teres, offering up the spices on the mizbeach k'teres together with the menorah, and so they are done as a sequence. First the k'teres, then the neiros, and only after, and that's the end of the day. And before that is the Korban Pesach, and before that was the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim. Continues the Gemara. Vitanya, we saw in another brisa, Kikushyon. We asked at the beginning, 3 lines from the top of the Omud, we asked a question. We asked that if Korban Pesach is after Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim, because it says Bo'erev and Beinu Arbaim, then it should also be after the K'teres and after the Adlokas Neiros. And so why do you say that K'teres and Adlokas Neiros is after the Korban Pesach? The Gemara before said you learn it out from Oisai. However, there's a brisa that actually puts Korban Pesach after K'teres and Neiros. Tomid koidem leK'teres. Korban Tomid was before K'teres. K'teres koidemes leNeiros. The K'teres was before the Hadlokas Neiros. The Neiros koidmes lePesach. And the Hadlokas Neiros was before the Korban Pesach. The very last thing that was done was the Korban Pesach. Why? As we saw before, we delay the Korban Pesach where it says in the Pasuk Bo'erev and Beinu Arbaim l'davar shelo ne'emar bo elo Beinu Arbaim bilvad, to all those things where it only says Beinu Arbaim and not Bo'erev, and that includes the Korban Tomid, the K'teres, and the Neiros. Asks the Gemara, according to this price of Hoksiv Oisai, do you not learn from the pasuk of Oisai me'erev ad boiker that the very last avodah done in the Beis Hamikdash has to be Oisai, has to be the Hadlokas Neiros? Says the Gemara, that's to teach us a different halacha. Hai Oisai mi boile limute avodah shebifnim. Umayniu k'teres. The oisoi that it says by Adlokas Neiros, that is the very last avodah, it's talking about only the avodas done in the heichal. In the heichal, only 2 avodas are done: the menorah and the k'teres. So to teach us that the menorah is done is after the k'teres. The very last thing that's done in the heichal is the menorah, and the k'teres is done before it. However, even after the neiros, not in the heichal, in the azara, by the mizbeach, the big mizbeach, that's where they would do the Korban Pesach. I may have thought, since it says in the pasuk, Uvahalois Arin is haneros, when Aaron would light the candles of the menorah, Beinu Arbaim, then Yaktireno K'teres Tomid Lifnei Hashem L'Doroseichem. Then after he lights the menorah, you bring the K'teres. That's how we would read the pasuk. And only then Yaktireno, you bring the K'teres. Nadlik Neiros Bereisha, we may have thought you first light the candles, V'hodor Naktir K'teres, and only after that you burn the K'teres. Therefore, Miut Rachmana Oisoi, that's why it says Oisoi by the Neiros, Miut Rachmana Oisoi, that the Neiros is the very last avodah, and the K'teres have to be done before. Elo Beinu Arbaim Yaktireno Lomoli. How are you going to learn, or what's when the pasuk says that Aaron HaKohen, he would light the candles beinu arbaim, and then the pasuk says yaktireno ktoires tomid lifnei Hashem d'oreisechem. Why? Before we assumed in the Havamin of the Gemara, we assume it means after the neiros you bring the ktoires. But now that we know that ktoires is before the neiros, what do we do with the fact that it says uvahalis Aaronis haneros beinu arbaim and then yaktireno lomoli? Says the Gemara, Hochi Komer Achmona. This is how you have to read the pasuk. Beidon de madlekes neiros. That means beinu arbaim. Uvahalus Aaronis haneiros beinu arbaim yaktireno. What does yaktireno mean? Tehei mekatra ktoires. The ktoires should already have been offered on the mizbeach even before the neiros. So yaktireno is not after the menorah. You should offer the ktoires on the mizbeach. No, rather, when you light the menorah, the ktoires should already have been put on the mizbeach. Continues the Gemara, Tonu Rabbanon. There's nothing that is put onto the fire on the mizbeach before the korban tomid shel shachris, elo ktoires bilvad. The only thing that is burnt in the Beis Hamikdash before the korban tomid shel shachris is the ktoires. The ktoires was brought twice a day, once before the korban tomid shel shachar and once after the korban tomid shel beinu arbaim. Shenemar bo, regarding the ktoires, it says baboiker, baboiker. It says twice the word baboiker. V'yuktam ktoires dover shenemar boi baboiker baboiker. Tichsiv v'hikte oleo Aaron ktoires samim baboiker baboiker ledover sheloi nemar boi elo boiker echod. And that means from the fact that by the ktoires it says in the pasuk v'hikter olav Aaron ktoires samim baboiker baboiker, twice boiker, and by korban tomid it only says once the word baboiker, to teach us that the ktoires is brought even before the korban tomid shel shachar. Ve'in lechodovo shemisakiv achar tomid shel bein arbaim elo ktoires v'neiros v'pesach. And there's nothing which is delayed after korban tomid shel bein arbaim, only the ktoires and the neiros. Upesach, and here Pesach is written after ktoires and neiros, like in the second brisa we saw before. And this brisa adds there's one more thing that comes even after the korban tomid shel beinu arbaim, umechusar kippurim be'erev Pesach shetoivel sheinis v'oicheles pischoi lo erev. This is the opinion of the Tanna Kama. What's the case here? We know that when a person is tomei, then he has to go through the process of becoming toher. Different tumas have different halachas, and then on the final day he goes into the mikveh, he's toher. He waits till the end of the day, called Herev Shemesh, and then he's a Tvul Yom, and till the end of the day, and then he's toher. However, there are 4 people that on the 8th day, on the next day after they became toher, they actually have to bring a korban, a zov, a zova, a matzora, and a yoledes. And since they still have to bring the korban, they haven't yet reached their final kapara, and they're not allowed to eat kochim yet, not allowed to eat korbanis. And they are called mechusar kippurim, and Rashi brings here, and this is a Gemara in Makkas, that mechusar kippurim who eats kochim is actually chayav koros. On the 8th day, they have to bring their korban. Zov, Zova, Matzora, Yoledes, they each have their own different korbanos. But whichever korbanos they have to bring, they bring the korbanos on the 8th day. After that, midrabanon, they have to tovel in the mikveh again, and then they can eat kochim. What happens if on Erev Pesach was the 8th day of Zov, Zova, Matzora, or a Yoledes? And Rashi only brings some of those in the list, but that's something discussed in the Mefarashim. But what happens if somebody was a Mechusar Kippurim on Erev Pesach? He's Tahir, he's been to the mikveh the day before, he's had hair of Shemesh, but he hasn't brought his korban. He should have brought it that day, he forgot, or whatever the good or bad reason, he didn't bring his korban. They brought the korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim, and now he's stuck. You can't bring any other korbanos, and he has to bring the korban Pesach. Somebody who doesn't eat korban Pesach is chayav koros, and he can't eat the korban Pesach. Korban Pesach is kochim, is a korban, and Mechusar Kippurim is not allowed to eat kochim. What can he do? So according to the Tanna Kama here, since there's a mitzvah asay which is sheyesh bei koros of korban Pesach, they're even allowed to bring his korban of zov, zova, matzora, yoledes is allowed. Let's talk about the zov and the matzora, which are men. They're allowed to bring their korban of ziva or tzoras even after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim was brought, in order to allow him to have his kapara and then to bring the Korban Pesach. That was the opinion of the Tanna Kama. Rabbi Shmuel b'nei shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka Omer, af mechusar kippurim b'shayim mois hashana. In such a case, even the whole year, nothing to do with Korban Pesach. A person, there's a mitzvah to eat kochim, not only for Kohanim to eat their part in the korbanos, there's even a mitzvah for Yisrael to eat kochim. And since he's not allowed to eat kochim before he's brought his korban, and on the 8th day, for a good or bad reason, he didn't bring his korban, on that 8th day, even after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim, he can bring his korban that he needs for his kapara, whichever the korban will be, Zov, Zova, Matzera, Yiledes, and then they can eat kochim after that. And this korban, this kapara they need, can be brought even after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim, according to Rabbi Yishmael b'nei shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. Shetovel v'oichel b'kochim ba'erev, he can after he brings his korban, he's tovel, and he can eat kochim. And Rashi explains that what the situation was, according to Rabbi Shmuel b'nei shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, was somebody who actually brought the korban shlomim on that 8th day, and the korban shlomim can be eaten that day and the next night. If he's not going to bring his kapara, then he's not allowed to eat the kochim. And since it's incumbent upon him, or there's a mitzvah for him to eat his korban shlomim, and he's going to lose that night, that day, and the following night he's going to lose if he has to wait to bring his korban only the next day. And since he's got a mitzvah to eat his shlomim, therefore we allow him to bring his kapara even after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim has been brought. And now, even the Gemara says here, Shetovel v'oichel b'kochim lo erev doesn't mean he has to wait for nightfall. There's no halacha of Herev Shemesh for Mechusar Kippurim. As soon as he brings his korban, he can already eat kochim. But since we're talking about that it was offered after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim, it's considered erev. But erev here does not mean that he has to wait till night. That's how the Bala Moira explains this. And says the Gemara. Now, and we're starting with the Tanna Kama now. We're going back to explain this price. So, Bishlei Mele Tanna Kama, according to Tanna Kama, I can understand why they say that the only time you're allowed to bring somebody who's Mechusar Kippurim, a Zovo, or Metzora, is allowed to bring their korban, even after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim, is only Erev Pesach. Why? Yovei Asei de Pesach, the mitzvahs Asei, of bringing a Korban Pesach, sheyesh beikoros, it's a very severe type of asay, because it's a mitzvah that if you don't bring a Korban Pesach, you could be punishable by koros. V'yitchen, it overrides asay de hashlama, the asay that says oleo hashleim that we learnt about before. Bring all korbanos on the Korban Tomid Shel Shachar, not on the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim. So that asay that teaches us don't bring korbanos after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim, that is overridden by the mitzvah asay of being able to eat the Korban Pesach. And because the asay d'ashlama she'ein by koros, it's not as severe. There's no issa koros, there's no oynish of koros if you bring a korban after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim. Elo Rabbi Shmuel b'nei shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, according to Rabbi Shmuel b'nei shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, that he says that any mechusar kippurim, who's got a shlomim that needs to be eaten, he's allowed to override the asay of not bringing any korbanos after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim in order to be mekayim the mitzvah of eating kochim, of eating his shlomim. My ulmei dehayasei mehayasei. What's the strength of the mitzvah of eating kochim, of eating his shlomim, that it can override the mitzvah of not bringing a korban after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim? Says the Gemara, Amar Ravina, Amar Rav Chizda. There's going to be two answers here. Rav Chizda says, you're right. You're not allowed to bring, even according to Rabbi Shmuel b'nei shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, you're not allowed to bring a korban after the Korban Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim. There's no reason to. This is naseh and this is naseh, and neither is stronger than the other to override it. However, there's one type of korban that is associated to a mechusar kippurim, which is talking about a metzora who is a poor man, and this metzora who's a poor man, the korban chatos he has to bring is actually a bird, and from a bird chatos, only the blood is sprinkled onto the mizbeach, but the bird itself is not put onto the fire of the mizbeach, and since nothing goes onto the fire of the mizbeach, there's no issue with doing that after the korban Tomid shel beinu harbaim. However, any other mechusar kippurim, where there's an actual korban that needs to be put onto the mizbeach, we would have a big problem with that. And indeed, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Bereika will agree to the Tanna Kama that it does not override the assay of not bringing any korban after the korban Tomid shel beinu harbaim. That was Rav Chizda's answer. Rav Papa Omar. Rav Papa says no. Afilu teima bechatos behema. It could even be referring to a chatos, which is an animal which has parts that actually have to be put onto the mizbeach. And then the question comes back. We understand the Tanna Kama that you're overriding the issa of not bringing a korban after the korban Tomid shel beinu harbaim in order to be able to eat the korban Pesach, which is a severe mitzvah, which is a very strong mitzvah. It's punishable by chorus if you don't do it. However, other than Erev Pesach, where you need to eat the korban Pesach, why are we allowing this person to bring a korban after the korban Tomid shel beinu harbaim? So Rav Papa explains, Malo, what he does is he takes the parts of the korban that need to be offered onto the mizbeach, he puts them up on the top of the mizbeach, umelino baroisha, and he leaves them there overnight at the top of the shel mizbeach, baroisha shel mizbeach, on top of the mizbeach. And this opinion holds, Rav Papa holds, that even though normally we know that emurim, the limbs, the parts of the animal that were supposed to go on the mizbeach, they can be left at the bottom of the mizbeach till the end of the night, not including the end of the night, which means by the time that it's morning, those korbanos have to be put on the mizbeach, otherwise there's a psulina. Those imurim that didn't make it onto the mizbeach through the night, we'll learn about that soon a bit more. If they didn't make it onto the fire overnight, they are not allowed to be, they are apostle, is psulina. They've stayed overnight and that's it. There's a discussion whether the parts that need to go on the mizbeach, in the event that they were actually on top of the mizbeach, just not on the fire, is there also a psulina? So Rav Papa says there's no psulina on top of the mizbeach. So take these parts of the korban chatos, do not offer them onto the mizbeach, onto the fire, because you're not allowed to offer anything onto the fire after the korban Tomid shel beinu harbaim. Leave them there. There won't be a psulina. The next morning, after korban Tomid shel shachar, you can put those limbs and whatever needs to go onto the mizbeach, you put them onto the mizbeach, and then the owners will have their kapara, and everything will be okay. That is what the opinion of Rav Papa. And we're going to discuss this a little bit now. And now the Gemara is first asking that you, Rav Chizda, how did Rav Chizda just explain Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Bereika that indeed animal korbanos are not allowed to be offered? We're talking here about a chatos, which is an oif, a metzora, only a poor man, a metzora. He can bring his chatos from a bird. The bird, nothing gets burnt on the mizbeach. There's no issue with doing it after the korban Tomid shel beinu harbaim. Asks the Gemara, that's very good as far as the chatos is concerned, but a metzora, even a poor man, he has to bring other korbanos, not only a chatos, he has to bring a korban osham as well. V'ho'ika osham. The osham is not a bird, it's an animal. How's he going to get his kapara? If he can't bring his korban osham, he doesn't have his kapara, and you're back to the same issue. He's still a mechusar kippurim. So the Gemara says, Bishlei Miller of Papa. According to Rav Papa, we have a solution. In the same way as he says that chatos behema, you do the shlita, you do the zrikas adam, and then the limbs, you just leave them on top of the mizbeach, there's no lina, you'll do the same here. Bishlei Miller of Papa, haynu demolin lo. They leave it overnight at the top of the mizbeach. They bring the korban osham, they sprinkle the blood, and they put the parts of the osham that's going to go on the mizbeach on top of the mizbeach. That's okay. According to Rav Chizda, what's he going to say? He said before that the animals are not allowed to be brought, only the birds. Osham is an animal, not a bird. Answers the Gemara, Omri, we're talking about Shekirev Ashomi. We're talking about that the korban osham he brought before the korban Tomid shel beinu harbaim. He's already brought his korban osham. All that was left was the korban chatos. He's still a mechusar kippurim. Says Rav Chizda, if he's a poor man, a metzora, the chatos is a bird, and therefore you're allowed to offer it up onto the mizbeach. You're allowed to offer it and sprinkle the blood even after the korban Tomid shel beinu harbaim. Asks the Gemara, okay, you've taken care of the osham, you've taken care of the chatos, what about the korban oila, another korban that metzora has to bring, and that's also not from a bird? how's he going to bring that? Are you going to say that not bringing the korban oila is not ma'akav his kapara and is not mechusar kippurim, and he's allowed to eat kochim even if he hasn't yet brought his korban oila? V'tanya, did we not learn in a brayso b'shmol b'nei shel b'roichin b'bereika omer kashem shechatosei v'ashomi ma'akvin oisei kach oilosei ma'akvosei? In the same way as the chatos and the asham is ma'akav, before that he's still a mechusar kippurim, the oila also keeps him a mechusar kippurim till he brings the oila. What are you going to say? V'chitema, are you going to suggest, like you did with the Asham, b'shekorva oilosei, that he brought his oila before the korban tomid shel bein arbaim, and the whole issue is only the chatos? For that, Rav Chisda says that the chatos was an oif, was a bird, and was allowed to be brought after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim. Are you allowed to bring the korban oila before offering the korban chatos? Vatani, did we not learn in a brayso that the pasuk says v'hevi oisam el hakohen v'hikriv es asher lachatos rishona u'molakas reisha? It says that the chatos has to be brought first. V'hikriv es asher chatos lo rishona. Ma Talmud loima? What's the word lo rishona? Tell me. In lil moicha teiku demis la'ila, is it there to teach us that in that particular case, and over there we're not talking about Matzera, we're talking about a chatos is before oila. It says, are you trying to teach us shatei kudemes la'oila, that chatos has to be brought before oila? Haloi kvar nema, it says already, ves hasheni yase oila kamishpot v'chiper olav hakohen michatose hashechotov v'nislach loi. The pasuk says there explicitly, ves hasheni, that the second korban is the korban oila. So why does the pasuk have to say previously v'hikriv es asher lachatos rishona? Elozeh bono av. The reason it says that is in order to build a source. It should be a rule. Lekol hachatois yu koidmois lechol ha'oilos habois imoem. That all korban chatos have to be before the korban oila that's brought with them. So you see clearly the korban oila has to be brought before the korban chatos. V'kaimelon. And the halacha is that afilu chatos ha'oif koidemis la'oilas behema. For example, in the case of a korban yoledes, in the event that she's not poor, then she brings a chatos, which is a bird, and an oila, which is a behema. And the halacha is that even chatos ha'oif is before oilas behema. So oila is always after chatos. If so, this Matzera we're talking about, Matzera oni, he couldn't bring the oila before the chatos. And we're talking here about that you're allowed to bring the chatos after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim, says Rav Chisda, because there's no part of the bird gets put onto the mizbeach. But the korban oila, which is going to be brought afterwards, and it's ma'akav, as we saw before he brings the korban oila, he's not yet relieved of his psul of mechusar kippurim. So how is he going to bring the korban oila according to Rav Chisda? Omar Rava shani oilas Matzera. Rava says that the oila of Matzera is different. Derachmona Omar, because the pasuk says regarding that particular oila of a Matzera, the pasuk says v'helo hakohen es ha'oila v'es hamincha mizbeicha v'chiper olav hakohen v'tohir, and really it should have said v'es ha'oila yale. You should offer up the oila. What does it mean v'helo hakohen es ha'oila? Why does it use an interesting term v'helo? Says the Gemara to tell us shehelo kvar, that you bring the korban, you're allowed to bring the korban oila before the chatos in the case of this Matzera. And since you're allowed to bring the korban oila before the korban chatos, according to Rav Chisda, when Rabbi Shmuel b'nei Rabbi Yochanan ben Bereika says you're always allowed to, Mechusar Kippurim is always allowed to bring his kapara even after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim, it means this poor Matzera, that the oila was brought before the korban tomid shel bein arbaim, and the asham was brought before the korban tomid shel bein arbaim. All that was left was the chatos. The chatos is a bird and could be brought after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim. That's how we explained, that's how Rav Chisda is going to deal with this. Continues the Gemara, and now we're going to ask a question on Rav Papa. Omar le Rav Shimon bar Abba le Rav Papa. Liditcha, according to Rav Papa, how did Rav Papa explain Rabbi Shmuel b'nei Rabbi Yochanan ben Bereika, who said that Mechusar Kippurim is always allowed to bring his kapara even after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim? So Rav Papa said it's talking about even an animal, a behema, which has parts that go on the mizbeach. Rav Papa said, "Maila umelino b'roisha shel mizbeach put the parts that need to go onto the Mizbeach, put them on top of the Mizbeach. Don't leave them at the foot of the Mizbeach. And if they're on top of the Mizbeach, there's no lina. They're not going to become posel by virtue of the fact that they were not put onto the fire overnight. And in the morning, you wait for the korban tomid shel shachar to be brought, and then you put these emurim onto the Mizbeach. The Gemara is going to now have two questions on that. First, Rav Shimon bar Abba asked Rav Papa, according to you, Rav Papa, that you're allowed to put these parts, these limbs and the fats, these emurim, onto the top of the Mizbeach, are we really going to allow you to do something that could cause something negative to happen? There could be a big mistake here. Because since the other korbanos, that the shlita was done before the korban tomid shel bein arbaim, and the zrikas hadam was done before the korban tomid shel bein arbaim, the halacha is you're allowed to put the imurim up even after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim, and that was done right through the night. It actually corresponds to our tfilas ma'ariv, which is done through the night. Here you have a korban that the shchita and zrika was done after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim. You're not allowed to offer up these parts of the korban onto the mizbeach, since the korban itself was not started. The shchita and zrika was not done before the korban tomid shel bein arbaim. So you're not allowed to put it onto the mizbeach. And where Papa indeed said, leave it there on top of the mizbeach until after the next morning, korban tomid shel shachar is brought. But you can leave these parts of the korban on top of the mizbeach. The kohanim may, by mistake, take those emurim and put them onto the mizbeach together with all the other emurim of the korbanos that were brought on time before the korban tomid shel bein arbaim, where they were supposed to, and they had to put those limbs onto the mizbeach, onto the fire overnight. And here you're going to cause the kohanim to make a serious mistake. They're going to transgress the issa of oleo hashlem. They're going to put these limbs onto the mizbeach before the next korban tomid shel shachar, and we said before you're not allowed to do that. And the kohanim that are working through the night, the sovri, they're going to think the yomahu, that these parts of the animals waiting on top of the mizbeach belong to korbanos that were shechted and sprinkled their bloods during the day before the korban tomid shel bein arbaim was brought. The yomahu va'oselekture, they might by mistake come and put it onto the mizbeach, and that's very serious. Answers the Gemara that there's no issue with that. Omar later of Papa is going to answer to Rav Shimon bar Abba. Kohanim's rizimheim, kohanim are very meticulous, and the kohen that's going to put these limbs on top of the mizbeach is going to announce to everybody, do not put them onto the fire overnight, because it's actually a korban that was brought after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim. You're not allowed to put the imurim on the fire overnight, and the kohanim who are very meticulous will not come to make any mistakes. Now the Gemara is asking another question on Rav Papa. Homeler of Ashi of Kahana. V'omrila of Huna Bereder of Nosan of Papa. Either Rav Ashi asked the question to Rav Kahana, or Rav Huna asked the question to Rav Papa. V'hakama deloi miskatra imurim. He says, very good. What's your Papa saying? You're saying that when Rabbi Shmuel ben Eish Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika and the Brisa said that you're allowed to bring a korban, even not on Erev Pesach, the whole year round. If somebody brought a shlomim, he's now got a mitzvah and it's incumbent upon him to eat that shlomim, but he can't because he's a mechusar kippurim and he didn't bring his kapara during the day. You're allowed to bring his kapara even after the korban tomid shel bein arbaim. That's what Rav Papa said. And that's what Rav Shmuel said. How did Rav Papa explain that? Do the shchita, do the zrika. You're not allowed to offer those parts of the korban onto the mizbeach. Okay, leave them on top of the mizbeach. They won't be put on the fire till the next morning. What have you gained? Asks the Gemara. All the while that you don't actually burn the murim, these limbs, these parts of the korban that need to be put on the fire, all the while you don't actually put them on the fire, kohanim le'motzu ochli, basar, then the kohanim cannot eat their part of the korban. Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, yochel yu kohanim rashoyim b'chozav v'shoik, koydem aktoras imurim. You may have thought that the kohanim can eat their part of all these korbanos, which is the chozed, the breast of the animal, and the shoik, which is the back right thigh of the animal. Koydem aktoras imurim, they can eat it before the imurim get put on the mizbeach. Talmud Lema, it says in the pasuk, First the kohen puts the fats on the mizbeach, and only then the chest goes to the kohanim. and all the while the Kohanim are not allowed to eat their part of the korban, which is the chozeh and the shoik, bailim lo miskapra, then the owners do not get their kapara, and they still have the status of mechusar kippurim, and they still can't eat any kodshim. So you, Rav Papa, what have you gained? You're going to put the animal on top of the mizbeach and not offer it onto the fire, which means that the korban is not going to have a vehiktir akoyin es achelev hamizbecha, and if there's no vehiktir akoyin es achelev hamizbecha, then there's also no v'hoyo achozel aaron avonov, and if there's no v'hoyo achozel aaron avonov, then there's no kapara for the person. The Tanya, because as we learned in the Braisa, the pasuk says v'ochlu oisam asher kupar bohem, that the Kohanim, the eating of the Kohanim, their parts of the korban, is actually what finalizes the atonement, the kapara. That only after the Kohanim eat their part, the owners have their kapara. And if the owners don't have the kapara, it's still mechusar kippurim. So what have you gained, you Rebbe Shmuel, who say that you want this person to be able to eat from his shlomim, so you're allowing him to bring the korban of his mechusar kippurim? You haven't gained anything. The Kohanim can't eat it because you don't put them on the mizbeach according to Rav Papa. You don't put the parts that belong on the mizbeach onto the mizbeach. So there's no kapara. It's still mechusar kippurim. Answers the Gemara, no. Omar li. Kiven deloy efshar asom kamisha nitzmu she'avdu. It's true that we saw in the pasuk before that the pasuk says v'hiktir akoyin es achelev hamizbecha. You first have to put the chalovim, the fats and the limbs onto the mizbeach, and only afterwards v'hoyo achozel le'Aaron u'levonov. Then the Aaron and his children, which means the Kohanim, they get their parts, which is the breast and the back right thigh, called chozeh v'shoik. But that's not always true. It's true that when the emurim are there, when the chalovim, when the fats, when the limbs that go on the mizbeach they still exist, then they have to be put onto the mizbeach before the Kohanim can eat it. However, in certain circumstances, for example, if those limbs actually became tomei, or they got lost, and the shlita was done okay, the zrika was done, the blood was sprinkled. Now what was supposed to happen was that the parts that were supposed to go on the mizbeach should have been put on the mizbeach, and then the parts going to the kohen could be eaten by the kohen, and the owners will be atoned. What happens if the parts that are supposed to go on the mizbeach became tomei or got lost? What then? In that case, we allow the kohanim to eat their parts, even though the parts that were supposed to go on the mizbeach didn't get there because they became tomei or they got lost. And the Gemara is now going to say the very fact that you're not allowed to put the imurim onto the mizbeach because oleo hashleim, you have to wait till the next morning. It's similar to a case where those parts actually got lost or tomei, and the kohanim are allowed to eat it even before the parts get put on the mizbeach. And that's how Rav Papa is going to say that the people, that this mechusar kippurim, he will get his kapara because the kohanim can eat their chozeh v'shoik even before the imurim get put on the mizbeach. The Tanya we learned in the Braisa, Yochel, I may have thought nitmu imurim she'avdu, if the imurim, if these parts that are supposed to go on the mizbeach became tomei she'avdu, that they got lost, lo yu kohanim zakoyin b'chozeh v'shoik, that since we will not be able to comply with v'hiktir akoyin es achelev hamizbecha, then also v'hoyo achozel aaron u'levonov doesn't apply. They won't get the chozeh v'shoik. Talmud Lema says in the pasuk, no, v'hoyo achozel aaron u'levonov. The pasuk says, explicitly states that the chozeh, the breast, and the other parts, the chozeh v'shoik, they are going to be given to Aaron u'levonov in every circumstance, even in the event that the imurim were not put onto the mizbeach. So here too, says Rav Papa, in this case, we're going to compare our case to Tomei and Ovad, and the Kohanim can eat the chozeh v'shoik, and the owners will have their kapara, even though the imurim will only be put on the mizbeach the following day after the korban tomid shel shachar. Continues the Gemara. Rav Kahana Rami Rav Kahana asked an apparent stira. Ksiv, in one pasuk it says, Lo yisizbach al chometz dam zivchi, v'lo yolin chelev chagi ad boiker. The pasuk of Loyolin Chelev Chagi Ad Boiker means that the Korban Chagiga don't let the parts that have to go on the Mizbeach wait overnight till the morning. That's called Lina, and the Korbanos, the Apostle Belina, and here we're not talking about they're on the top of the Mizbeach, and there's a whole discussion whether Yesh Lina Bareish HaMizbeach or not. Here we're talking about regular Lina, where the limbs are left at the foot of the Mizbeach. The Kohanim was supposed to offer all these limbs and fats onto the Mizbeach overnight. If they got to the morning, then they become psul lina. Ad boikehu de lo yolin. You're not allowed to leave these limbs all the way till the morning, says the Pasuk. Ha kol halaylo, but through the night, ha kol halaylo kulo yolin. As we said before, that you're allowed to leave the limbs at the foot of the Mizbeach. The Kohanim, through the night, would put all those emurim and the chalovim that didn't manage to get put onto the Mizbeach before the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim. As long as the shlita and the zrika was done before the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim, the emurim could be put onto the Mizbeach overnight. That's what it says in one pasuk. We know that to be true. There's another pasuk, Uchsiv, V'hiktir oleo chel ve'ashlomim, oleo hashlim kol ha'korbanos kulam. Now we're asking the basic question that how can all these emurim actually be put onto the Mizbeach overnight? It's true that the shchita and the zrika was done before the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim, but how can you put the parts that are going to be burnt on the Mizbeach? How can you put them on the Mizbeach overnight? You're putting these parts onto the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim. And we've been learning the whole Daf today. We've been learning that you're not allowed to put anything onto the Mizbeach after the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim. Why should the hekta imurim v'chalovim of the Korban of the day before be allowed to be put on? That was the question that Rav Kahana asked. Says the Gemara, Hu moisav lo v'hu mefarik lo. He asked the question and he answered it, Keshe nitoisru. That indeed he understood that providing that the Zrikas Hadam was done before the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim, since it was able to be put, potentially, it could have been put on the Mizbeach before the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim, therefore, it's as if it's already on the car, it's so to speak, it's already hushlam, it's already become completed, it's a korban that's associated to the Korban Tomid Shel Shachar, because before the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim, this animal was already ready for the Mizbeach. Technically, they didn't have time to put it on, or there were too many korbanos on the fire at that point. They were allowed to then finish off the actual putting it onto the Mizbeach after the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim. But that's only because it was already ready for the Mizbeach before the Korban Tomid Shel Beinu Arbaim. Continues the Gemara. Romile Rav Safra l'Rav. Rav Safra asked Rav another apparent contradiction in the Psukim. Ksiv, it says in one pasuk, Lo yolin laboike zevach chag haPesach. The pasuk says, Lo sishchat al chometz dam zivchi v'lo yolin laboike zevach chag haPesach. The Korban Pesach is not allowed to be left. The parts that have to go on the Mizbeach, the chalovim and whatever parts went on the Mizbeach, were not allowed to be left at the foot of the Mizbeach, not be put on the Mizbeach right through the night. As we saw before, you're not allowed to leave it till the morning. Ha kol halaylo yolin. But you are allowed to put the fats of the Korban Pesach that were going to go onto the Mizbeach, they were allowed to be put on the Mizbeach right through the night. Now he's asking a very interesting question. V'aksiv, it says in the pasuk, Oilas Shabbos b'Shabbatoi al Oilas haTomid v'Niska. There's a special Korban Oila was brought on Shabbos every Shabbos, and that Shabbos was brought al Oilas haTomid besides for the Korban Tomid that was brought every day. What do we learn from there? Oilas Shabbos b'Shabbatoi. The Shabbos Oila is allowed to be put onto the Mizbeach because it's the Shabbos Korban. V'loi Oilas Choil b'Shabbos. But if you had this Korban, a Korban Oila, that needed to be put on the Mizbeach, and it was a Friday's Korban, and you didn't have time to put those Korbanos onto the Mizbeach on Friday, you're not allowed to put them on the Mizbeach on Friday night. V'loi Oilas Choil b'Yom Tov, the same with Yom Tov. The Yom Tov Korbanos, of course, you can put on the Mizbeach. The Erev Yom Tov Korbanos, you're not allowed to put on the Mizbeach as you would all other Korbanos the whole year round. The Korbanos of the day, if you didn't have time, you can put their parts onto the Mizbeach the following night. But if it's Yom Tov the following night, you're not allowed to put the weekday Korbanos, those parts, onto the Mizbeach on Yom Tov. So over here we have a problem. The Korban Pesach, when was it brought? On Erev Pesach. It's a weekday Korban. The night after that, Leil Pesach, is Yom Tov. How could they put the parts of the Korban Pesach onto the Mizbeach through the night? You're not allowed to put the Erev Yom Tov parts onto the Mizbeach on Yom Tov. Omar Lei. So Rav answered back to Rav Safra, Kvaromya ni'alei Rav Acha bar Chia l'Rabavo. This question was actually asked by Rav Abba bar Chia, to Rabavo. V'shani lein, and Rabavo answered as follows, that Hocha, this posuk that seems to be telling us that Lo Yolin Laboike, the parts of the Korban Pesach that need to go on the Mizbeach, they're not allowed to be left till the morning, but overnight, even though it's Yom Tov, you're allowed to put it on the Mizbeach, that pasuk is talking about Barbos or Shecholiyos b'Shabbos. Oskinon, we're talking about that Erev Pesach was on Shabbos. So Erev Pesach was on Shabbos, so it's a Shabbos korban. The Chelve Shabbos, craving be Yom Tov. If Motzah Shabbos is Yom Tov, you're allowed to take the fats of the Shabbos korbanos and offer them up, even on Yom Tov. And so this pasuk, which allows you to offer the fats of the korban Pesach onto the Mizbeach, even on the night of the 15th, is talking about that the Erev Pesach is a Shabbos, is Shabbos. Omar Le. So now Rav asked Rav Safra back. Omar Le. Rav Safra now asked Rav back. Some say it wasn't Rav before, some say it was Rava. But either way, Rav Safra asked that Mishum de Chelve Shabbos craving b'Yom Tov, just because this halacha is true, that the fats of the Shabbos korbanos you're allowed to offer on Motzah Shabbos, even though it's Yom Tov, is that good enough reason that we can establish that the pasuk that says Lo yolin laboika zeva chag Pesach, from where we learn that the Pesach, the fats of the korban Pesach, are allowed to be offered on the Mizbeach on the night of the 15th, on Yom Tov. Is that good enough reason to say that this pasuk is only talking about an Erev Pesach which falls on Shabbos? The pasuk doesn't say that. The pasuk says that the fats of the korban Pesach can always be offered up on Yom Tov night. And then the question comes back. We know that the korbanos of the weekdays are not allowed to be offered up. That means the fats are not allowed to be offered up on Yom Tov. Omar Le. So he answered back to Rav Safra and he said, Shavkei lekra, leave the psukim alone. It's okay. It's self-evident. It's not as if we are introducing and establishing that this pasuk is only talking about one case, and then you're asking me who gives me the right to do that. It's not about us. The pasuk itself is demanding that that's how you understand it. Dehu dochik. The contradiction in the psukim itself. Now, on the one hand, the Torah tells us you're not allowed to offer up korbanos of the weekdays on Yom Tov, and another pasuk that says that the korban Pesach fats can be offered on Yom Tov. It lends itself. The pasuk itself is, so to speak, telling you that I'm only talking about if Erev Pesach is Shabbos and Shabbos fats are allowed to be offered on Yom Tov, and that's the only time where you're allowed to put the fats of the korban Pesach onto the Mizbeach on Yom Tov. But in any other case, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to continue the next Mishnah from here.